You've heard the phrase where players and coaches say that sometimes it's just a matter of luck that a team can end the season with a championship. Not just about which team can execute and make the most of their talent, but sometimes it's about which team can stay healthy till the end of the season. Well, the same thing can be said about a player's career. Sometimes the difference between a player making the Hall of Fame or being regarded as one of the greatest players of all time is whether or not they can stay healthy. And as you'll see in this short list, there are other circumstances that can prevent a player from having that elusive title as being one of the greatest players of all time. Take for example, the all-time greatest NBA book, which is most famous for its top 100 players list. There are players on that list that were blessed with long careers and played alongside some all-time great players. Think of players like Tony Parker or Robert Parrish. They're not exactly the greatest talents we've ever seen, but they had very prosperous careers. Something that the players that we are going to mention didn't have. But if they did, they would have absolutely made the top 100 list. So let's find out who some of the players are, and we'll go in chronological order, from the oldest examples to our most recent. Let's start with Connie Hawkins. Check out what Hall of Fame coach Larry Brown said about him according to ESPN Sports Century. He said, "He was Julius before Julius. He was Elgin before Elgin. He was Michael before Michael. He was simply the greatest individual player I have ever seen." Kareem also called him one of the 15 greatest players he ever played with or against. They had such high regard for him because he was ahead of his time. He was the first modern power forward with athleticism, length, and great court vision. Think of someone like Kevin Garnett, but without that tenaciousness on defense. He wasn't ever considered a respectable defensive stopper, but he would have dominated the league on the scoring end. In fact, in his second and last season in the ABA, he averaged 30.2 points per game on 51% shooting and 11.4 rebounds per game. That's the type of damage that he was capable of doing. So what happened to him? Well, we're talking about the biggest injustice that an NBA player has ever faced. In 1961, the NCAA suffered a major gambling scandal. The scandal involved 37 arrests of students from 22 different colleges. Jack Molinas, a former basketball player, was implicated in this gambling scandal. He was accused of fixing college basketball games and selling the fixed games to gamblers. So what does Connie Hawkins have to do with this? Well, Jack Molinas loaned Hawkins $250 during his freshman year at Iowa, but never encouraged him to throw games. In fact, Molinas insisted repeatedly that Hawkins had no participation or knowledge of fixing games. However, that wasn't enough for the NCAA, as he was kicked out from Iowa University and never played a game for them. And apparently for NBA Commissioner Walter Kennedy, that was also enough for him to make the decision of banning Connie Hawkins from playing in the NBA. The only thing that he was guilty of was simply knowing Jack Molinas. In fact, there wasn't a single legal charge that Hawkins was guilty of, but the NBA blackballed him for years. It wasn't until 1969 when the NBA lifted the ban after settling a lawsuit Hawkins had filed against him. So at the age of 27, Connie Hawkins finally played his first game in the NBA as a member of the Phoenix Suns. That's potentially 7 to 8 years that we're stripping away from his prime. However, he immediately made an impact for the Suns and was selected to be an All-Star 4 seasons in a row. Unfortunately, too much time had passed for the NBA world to truly see what he was capable of doing. He is already considered by many of his contemporaries as one of the innovators of this league, but he didn't have a huge impact on the next generations of players because they just didn't see him at his best. None of us did. If he didn't suffer such injustices, I think he would have had a legendary career. Many basketball historians, including former players, believe that. It's a shame that the league took that away from him. The next player that we're going to talk about is David Thompson. In the late 70s, if we're talking about the most exciting players to watch, it was Julius Erving and then David Thompson. He was an incredible offensive talent that was supposed to be the next big thing in the NBA. I mean, this is the same guy that Michael Jordan chose to induct him into the Hall of Fame because he loved his game so much. David Thompson was known for his ability to hang in the air before finishing, which is why his nickname was Skywalker. Now, doesn't that sound like what Air Jordan could do? So he was a big inspiration to arguably the greatest player in NBA history. The best example that proves how great he was came in the 1977-78 season. He averaged a career high 27.2 points per game on 52% shooting, 4.9 rebounds per game, and 4.5 assists per game. That was a year when David Thompson had the fourth highest scoring game in NBA history. He scored 73 points on 74% shooting against the Detroit Pistons. He was so good that he finished third in MVP voting that season, behind Bill Walton and George Gervin. And by the way, when he accomplished all of that, he was only 23 years old, so he hadn't even reached his peak yet. So what happened to him? It was a variety of things. The biggest thing was injuries. Thompson suffered through a series of injuries in his last 3 seasons with the Denver Nuggets. In 1980, he tore a ligament away from his left heel that occurred before the halfway mark of the season. Then early in the 1981-82 season, Thompson suffered a knee injury that grounded this high-flying player. With him out of the lineup, the Nuggets got used to playing without their star player. So the Nuggets thought it was a good idea for him to come off the bench for the remainder of the season. So that's why he went from averaging over 25 points per game the previous year to averaging less than 15 points per game. Unhappy with his role on the team, he asked for a trade and got sent to the Seattle Supersonics. It proved to be a great move at first, as the Sonics won the first 12 games of the season. Then in the 14th game, he suffered yet another knee injury and was forced to undergo arthroscopic surgery. But he only missed 8 games, and apparently he was cleared to play after only missing a month. Needless to say that he was not the same player after being rushed back so quickly, not giving him enough time to recover. Then the following season, he suffers damage to his knee ligaments after an altercation that occurred in a disco. So that was just one too many injuries that he suffered that ended his career prematurely. But there's another side to the story. Drug use was always linked to Thompson once the 80s began, and eventually took its toll on him. Here's how we know this. According to the New York Times in 1982, the police were conducting a cocaine investigation involving 4 members of the Nuggets, following reports about Thompson's alleged involvement with the drug. Then in 1983, Thompson was admitted to a Denver rehabilitation center to overcome his battle with drugs and alcohol. That is according to the Washington Post. Then in September of 1985, Thompson wanted one last chance to resume his NBA career, and he participated in a preseason tryout for the Indiana Pacers. However, they passed up on the opportunity because they didn't like the looks of his knee. That is a direct quote from the Washington Post. That's not me. Then later that night, it was reported that he was arrested at an Indianapolis bar for public intoxication. So it was a combination of some on-the-court and off-the-court issues that messed up his career. It's a shame because his talent level was all-time great. He could have ended up being one of the greatest scorers in NBA history, but we never got to see what he could have done at his peak. The next player that we're going to talk about is one of the most famous what-if players ever. We're talking about Anthony Hardaway. Let's put the numbers aside for a second. Let's talk eye test. Let's just talk about his pure basketball skill. One of the greatest I've ever seen. If you were watching basketball during this time, Penny was one of your favorite players to watch. He was for me. We're talking about a player that was deemed the next Magic Johnson. In fact, in 1995, the LA Times had this headline: Magic's Magic. Orlando's Hardaway, worthy of being the next Magic Johnson. So even the people in LA were conceding to the fact that he was going to be the next Magic Johnson. And how could they not? He had the Magic size, the court sense, the unselfishness, the flair. His playmaking ability was up there with Magic, but he had athleticism Johnson never dreamed of. So he could finish over the top of his defenders with the best of them. And the resume that he had for the first 4 years of his career all showed signs that we were potentially witnessing a player that was going to end up as one of the all-time greats. We're talking 2 straight All-NBA first-team selections, 1 third-place finish in MVP voting, a trip to the finals, a 60-win season with Shaq missing in the starting lineup for 30 games. And there's one playoff series that I want to highlight from Penny that shows what he was capable of. It was a first-round series against the Miami Heat in 1997. Now that Heat team was very tough defensively. They had the best defensive rating in the league, and they contained their opponents to 43% shooting. To illustrate how tough they were, Michael Jordan had the most inefficient playoff series of his career against the Heat in the conference finals that year. He shot 39% from the field. But in the first round series against the Orlando Magic, Penny averaged 31 points per game on 47% shooting. That includes 2 straight games when he scored over 40 points and shot over 50% from the field. Players didn't just do that against this team, but Penny was making shots from all over the floor, and there was nothing they could do to stop him. Unfortunately, that was the last time we saw Penny in his prime. By now, you probably already know the long list of injuries that Penny had in his career. But there's just one interesting fact about Penny that perfectly explains why his prime was cut so short. From 1997 to 2001, he had a total of 4 knee surgeries. I mean, no human alive can maintain the same athleticism after so many knee injuries. We all saw his potential, and it was through the roof, but his body betrayed him. Speaking of which, we get to the last player that we're going to talk about, and that's Derrick Rose. I wanted to include him in my book so bad, but injuries took his prime away too early in his career. The sad reality is that Derrick Rose will most likely make history as being the only player to not make the Hall of Fame while winning an MVP award. Whether or not we agree with him winning the MVP that season or not, we can all agree that at the tender age of 22, he was already considered as a top 3 player in the league. And think about what he accomplished that season. He averaged 25 points per game on 45% shooting, 7.7 assists per game, and 4.1 rebounds per game. At 6'2", he had the speed, the quickness, and the athleticism of someone like Russell Westbrook. Except, he was more controlled and played better within the flow of the game, instead of trying to reach a certain number of stats per game. So when everyone was predicting that the big 3 of the Miami Heat would shatter records in their first year together, it was the Chicago Bulls that had the best record in the league. And they went to the conference finals that year. Then the following season, the Bulls had the best record in the league again. So all signs were pointing that the Bulls were going to be the biggest threat to the Miami Heat in the East for years to come. However, in the first game of the playoffs, he tore his ACL. Then in the 10th game of the 2013-14 season, he suffered a meniscus tear to his right knee, which required surgery. Just like it was in the case of Penny Hardaway, the injuries kept mounting, and that just destroyed his career. I have no doubts that he would have ended up in that top 75 players list that the NBA released last season. Could have the Chicago Bulls went to the finals, or even won a championship if he never got hurt? Well, in 2014, we remember how old and banged up the Miami Heat looked in the playoffs. And the following year, Kevin Love got hurt in the first round, and Kyrie Irving missed half of the conference final series against the Atlanta Hawks. My best guess is that would have been their window of opportunity, and maybe they would have had some major playoff success. But who really knows? All that we can say for certain is that Derrick Rose was one of the most talented players to ever play the point guard position, but we never saw what he could do with all that talent. So that's the last player that I can say for certain that would have made the top 100 list. There are other players that consider mentioning like Tim Hardaway, but I already did a video about him, Amari Stoudemire, and Blake Griffin. They're great candidates, but I couldn't convince myself that there are no doubts that they would have been considered as one of the greatest players of all time. But if you have an argument for them, or if there are other players that I'm missing, let me know in the comment section. Thanks for tuning in. Till next time.